today we're going to be taking a look at our official first snowfall forecast for the winter of 2023 to 2024. So basically, just me saying how early could you get your first snowfall this year. We're going to be talking about the places that could get it sooner and potentially maybe even later than they normally do. So, as always, be sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon so you do not miss a future upload. And we're just going to go ahead and jump right into the video here. So we're going to start off here by taking a look at when we typically, what we typically have for an El Nino winter. And as you can see, typically in El Nino winters, we have the polar jet coming down in a fashion like this, kind of across central Canada and kind of scraping by the northern tier of the United States. And usually what this allows for is, since the jet stream is kind of on level with the northeast kind of stays average in an El Nino winter. And since it's coming down from central Canada, going kind of ridging over Alaska, and then kind of coming down this way below that jet stream, right, or the trough, if you will, below the ridge, we see warmer temperatures, typically speaking, across the northern tier, right, when we're below that ridging pattern, right, because the polar jet stream is typically shifted a little bit further to the north. However, we do have the Pacific jet stream, right, that kind of extends from the Pacific Ocean, right? There's a polar jet that comes from Canada and the Arctic, and then we have the Pacific jet that comes, of course, from the Pacific Ocean. Typically, one promotes, right, the polar jet is where you get that cold blast, right? But the Pacific jet usually just kind of promotes, wet and cooler times, kind of like a typical day in Seattle, right? You know what I'm talking about? Like a wet and cold and chilly, right? So typically during in El Nino, we typically have wet and cooler conditions across like the southern, say, 1/3 of the country, and especially colder in some places, again, such as the Tennessee Valley points south, even as far south as the Gulf Coast even. So if we take a look at when do we usually see our first snow, so I kind of went ahead and made this map here to kind of show you guys when we typically see our first snow, right? And of course, you can also just find a lot of maps. I mean, they're all pretty much the same because, of course, when we typically see our first snow is pretty much not opinionated, if you know what I mean. Like, it's kind of like observed and recorded here. So typically speaking, the Gulf Coast, generally snow for you guys, sadly, is very rare. Doesn't mean it can't happen. Of course, it has happened, but it is very rare. As well as for places like San Francisco and downtown Los Angeles and San Diego. However, the mountains just to the north, especially like Los Angeles and San Diego, there's mountains not too far away to your north. Those areas, of course, are different, and that's kind of highlighted in those later blues, if you will. The slightly rare, right, meaning it certainly has happened before, but it's a little bit rare for snow to get this far south, right? And that's kind of like basically from like Charleston, South Carolina, onto like Jackson, Mississippi, San Antonio, Texas. Dallas, I would put more in that January to February because I feel like Dallas at least does. Typically, Dallas points north and west typically get that snow at some point. Usually, it's January to February. We're going to move on there in just a second. But also, again, those mountain ranges, again, just to the north of San Francisco and Los Angeles, slightly rare, but definitely, again, this is still kind of in the low-lying areas. The mountainous areas are kind of highlighted here in these blues. But January and February is somewhere in that range when we typically see our first snow. And, of course, it goes for North Carolina, not including the Smoky Mountains. Those are obviously sooner. But the low-lying areas, kind of like in Nashville and then into Memphis and then a little bit south of OKC, January to February is typically when we see our first snow. For even a place like Las Vegas, usually it's around, I would kind of put them in the slightly rare region. Again, the mountains not too far away from you to the north and west especially. January to February is somewhere in that range. And the higher elevations, obviously sooner than that. Parts of the 95 quarter now we're talking from New York and Philly to DC, usually around mid-December, December 15th to the 31st. And of course, kind of extending back into Kentucky, southern Missouri here, and then through southern Kansas, northern Oklahoma, down to the panhandle of Texas, usually around mid to late December is when we typically see our first snow. This kind of extends into the southern part of New Mexico up through central Arizona. And of course, kind of like those higher elevations of the Sierra Nevada, not because obviously if you go really high in the Sierra, right, typically that's when we see snow pretty early. And it could be as early as late November, early December, which we're going to get to in a second. Early December, kind of like from Boston, kind of down to State College, Pennsylvania, and then we're going down towards say St. Louis, Missouri, you guys could see your snowfall, typically speaking. Again, this is typically speaking, early to mid-December. Of course, for places like Kansas City, kind of like the northern panhandle of Texas, through a good chunk of New Mexico, northeast Arizona, kind of south of Salt Lake City there, typically early December. And may I add, of course, the December 15th to 31st on the coastlines of, say, Washington, Oregon, a little bit inland in there. With the higher elevations, you guys are in that early December timeframe. All right, so what about November? So late November is like this darker purple color, November 15th to the 30th. Typically, this is like coastal Maine, southern Vermont, of course, because we know northern is definitely gets it a lot sooner. Places in Ohio, of course, Chicago, like Des Moines, Iowa, right, parts of eastern Nebraska around Omaha, and then in through places like Salt Lake City, of course, northern Nevada, probably like east of Reno, and then kind of going up in those higher elevations in the Cascades a little bit more. Typically speaking, around mid-November to late November is when you could typically see your first snowfall. And I would even add kind of like this early November, this kind of pink region, kind of like in the highest elevations of the Sierra Nevada. I didn't want to add the pink because I thought it would maybe throw it off, but I would definitely add that pink area, which we're going to get to right now, that early November timeframe, if not sooner, actually, for the Sierra, because the Sierras are very high, like 5 figures in terms of like in feet of how high they are, because the mountains are very high there, and of course you're going to get your snow a lot sooner than areas maybe just like 10 miles to your south, right, in the lower valleys. If we take a look at the pink region, parts of northern Maine, not the northern tip, but northern Maine, kind of northern Vermont, the Adirondacks in New York, of course, typically around early November to mid-November. Parts of Detroit, including that, places like Minneapolis and Bismarck and Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Billings, Montana, for example, out to Boise, Idaho, even down towards Denver, Colorado, not in the higher mountains to your north and west, but kind of like, I mean, the city itself is a mile high, right? It's called the Mile High City for a reason, right? Denver. Um, yeah, typically speaking, Denver, kind of like that early November time frame is typically when we see our first snow. And finally, during the month of October, that's for these higher elevations in the Rocky Mountains, Casper, Wyoming, up through like western Montana, of course, the upper UP of Michigan, right, the Upper Peninsula, even just to the west of Sault Ste. Marie, up towards a place like Duluth, on that northeastern tip of Minnesota, October, and then in the northern tip of Maine. Typically, again, we see our first snow during the month of October. Now, you might recognize this. This was from my winter 2023 to 24 forecast video, because part of this is going to go into like how early or how late we could see our snowfall this year, right? Because again, temperatures. Of course, if you didn't see my winter forecast video, I'll definitely have it up in the top right there because it was definitely an important video to see kind of before seeing this one, if you will. But if you're watching it right now and didn't watch the other one, that's certainly okay. But this map kind of was referenced and made for that video. But you can see again the northern tier, again as consistent with a stronger El Nino, warmer than average for this winter across the northern tier and across that southern third of the United States, and even extending a little bit up towards California and a little bit up the East Coast. Some slightly cooler temperatures, and of course, as is consistent with that Pacific jet, we're going to see wet and cooler times, or I'm on the temperature map, a little spoiler, cooler times across the southeast and parts of the Gulf Coast. Now getting to the precipitation map, again, you can see wet and cold, again, for places in the southeast. Again, slightly wetter and extending up the East Coast, and of course, as well as places extending towards like Los Angeles. And again, due to the polar jet stream, we're going to see some ridging up across northern central. So again, usually, and as will be the case for this winter, below average precipitation is in the forecast for right now. Now we're going to take a look here at some kind of composite maps, and you kind of take a look at, typically speaking, and you can put any, sort of range of years you want, typically speaking, what happens, when we have, and then you can put in whatever year you want. So I kind of put in some El Nino, some moderate El Ninos, kind of like what we're in right now, and to kind of, that are similar strength to this one, and to kind of dictate what could potentially happen in this upcoming November and into the early winter. All right, so this is the early part of, this is the month of November, and then we have, of course, those El Nino months that are similar in strength. So temperatures in a strong El Nino, or moderate El Nino, I should say, during the month of November, typically bring us some cooler temperatures, especially in the central plains, extending up into the Midwest, right? It's where it's more emphasized, right? We see more steeper anomalies, right? Ranging anywhere from 3 to as much as 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit below average. However, typically, and the reason you might be wondering why I put November, is because November is typically the earliest month. Typically, I know October is for some of you. Typically, for a majority of the nation, the earliest the snowfall could ever happen is typically November. But there are, again, a significant amount still that do typically see snow in October and in the highest peaks even September. But November is kind of like a segue month into winter, which is also why I included it. But typically speaking, slightly warmer temperatures across the Northwest, which definitely played into my forecast a little bit. And parts of the East Coast and Southeast are typically cooler during these moderate El Nino months, moderate El Ninos during November. Now, how does precipitation usually play out? Usually, wetter for the Southeast, right? Basically, Tennessee, Kentucky points to the Southeast, and then up the East Coast as well into places like, of course, the 95 quarter into Maine. But of course, inland again in the northern tier, even parts of the Midwest, drier conditions, as is typical with an El Nino, as well as parts of the Northwest and the Pacific coast there, do typically see less precipitation during El Ninos that happen in the month of November. All right, now we're going to take a look. Again, this is also from my winter video. We take a look here at the temperature anomalies for a El Nino during, again, I got some El Nino years. And you can see, again, the southeast and the south central, it's really emphasized there, 3 to 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit below average typically. And that's a composite of all those years. That doesn't mean it will be 3 degrees below average because that's not that significant. I mean, it kind of is. But again, it's a composite. It's an average. So it could certainly be worse than that. Could not be. Maybe it won't be as bad as that. Right? That's the nice thing about having averages. It gives us an idea, not what the forecast will be. I think some people do tend to confuse those a little bit. In terms of temperatures during the winter, again, about average, but pretty much these areas, though, especially in the northern tier, snow is pretty much already fallen by December, January, and February. So, of course, this map is kind of geared towards the south because usually some spots in the south haven't seen their snow yet by the time the month of December and January rolls around. Right? So the fact that it's going to be cooler and usually is cooler in the southeast and wetter will play a significant part in this forecast. And you can see again in the precipitation anomalies, again, kind of showed from that winter video, southeast coast typically wetter, and then the Midwest and even parts of northern Tennessee Valley are typically drier, as well as parts of the Northwest and even into the Rocky Mountains. So with all that said, let's now take a look at the snowfall arrival time anomalies, okay? So I do think that it will arrive a little bit later than average. Now, that could mean maybe it arrives at the end of October as opposed to the beginning of October because some places in the extreme northern tier do get it that early. But I do think because of the jet stream, it's going to be doing a little bit something like this. And the fact that we're going to have that Pacific jet kind of coming in like this brings some cooler and wetter conditions. I think that gives the southeast parts, and I would even shift this or extend this, if you will, a little bit further south as well. It says sooner than average. This doesn't guarantee snow, but I think this will, I think if it does come, it will come sooner than average for places in the southeast because of that Pacific jet and that polar jet coming down close, but not, not kind of, the jet streams aren't touching because that would really form a big storm system. But I do think, again, especially in those mountainous areas where they typically do get snow in the southeast, I do think it will arrive sooner than average, again, because it's typically cooler and wetter during an El Nino. And, of course, I do think it will arrive a little bit later than average. Doesn't mean you're going to get no snow at all in the northern tier. I just think it will arrive later than average, of course, due, again, to that polar jet kind of to the north. And, of course, based on historical data that shows us that even during November and even parts of the early winter that we typically see those warmer temperatures and these drier conditions. All right, so that was it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I definitely look forward to providing more updates to this as well as my winter forecast down the line. Of course, as autumn progresses, this will definitely get more and more exciting to take a look at. So definitely stay tuned for future videos. Again, be sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon, and I will see you guys in the next video. I am the Weather Dude signing off till next time.